Jackie is a clinical consultant, keynote speaker, and co-founder of the Center for Emotional Wellness in Crystal Lake and Arlington Heights. She's also an author of several books and publications, including School Refusal in Children and Adolescents and Successful Parenting, Create Your Custom Plan for Raising Independent Children into Adulthood. Jackie is also the co-host of the Successful Parenting podcast series. So Jackie, I think we're ready for you.
I want to start off tonight. We're going to do this a little bit backwards. I'm going to kind of give a little bit more detail about myself in a few. I want to start off by asking you to put in the chat what you would consider some characteristics of a resilient child. That's going to be a little bit of the focus tonight. We are going to be talking about building resiliency. And so I wanted to get some feel from you all of what you would consider characteristics of a resilient child. Okay, problem solve. Moves with changes. I like that. Flexible. Easily adaptable. Never gives up, perseveres, can manage upset. I like that. So far we got problem solving, moving with change, flexible, easily adaptable, perseveres, tolerates frustration. I like that one too. I like them all. These are good. And the reason why I want you to think a little bit about this, because I think many of us are here tonight because we want to have, some ideas and strategies to raise a resilient child, adapt to different situations and different personalities. When I was doing some research and when I've been, really looking at, characteristics and how we can help facilitate resilience with our kiddos, one of the things that keeps coming up is much of what you've mentioned is a child that can really draw their effort and their work to outcomes, that they can realize that hard work can make a difference in what is happening for them, or possibly doing something different. Someone that can handle adversity as well as tolerate discomfort. So we are going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. And I also see on here positive outlook and flexible, and those are definitely characteristics that we are going to be referencing as we go through. Just a little bit about me. Most of you know me, I have 2 adult children, and both of my kids now, 24 and 25, totally different, even though they're a year apart. At different points, both my girls have gone through difficult situations. They've gone through loss. They've gone through heartache. They've gone through challenges. And so I know as a parent how challenging it can be when our kiddos are struggling. For me, it would cause me to be anxious when they were having a hard time, because 1, I couldn't control it, and 2, I wanted my girls to be happy and successful. And so the problem with that was, because I wanted them to be happy and successful, I would sometimes make things too comfortable for them, right? I wanted them to be confident. So maybe I would praise them too much rather than allowing them to kind of experience that discomfort and realizing kind of some of that praise had to come through working through that adversity like you all talked about. And so when I talk about things tonight, it's as a clinician who has worked with parents as a long time, but it's also as a parent myself. And, I remind parents, and Lauren would say the same thing, all of our kids are going to struggle at different points. It's really teaching them how to struggle and how to tolerate discomfort. And we talk about that all the time. I joke, I love my dog Nala. I adopted her in the pandemic, and these are just some things about me and my family. I think it's important for you to recognize that I'm, a parent too. I've gone through many of the challenges that you may have possibly. And much of what I'm going to share, take what's helpful and leave the rest. There's not one size fits all for every family. Every family is different. But no, you're not alone. All parents have concerns for their children, especially during the pandemic. We're seeing new things, and we're chartering on new waters. And most caring parents want their children to be happy and successful. And I think that's why we do have a tendency to lean in and probably intervene and react as quickly as we do. So Lauren and I use this a lot, actually. And one of the reasons why I'm going to ask you tonight to put something more in the chat. This is called a social emotional scale. And we do these with kids all the time. And one of the things we do is we work with our students on recognizing how they're feeling, whether it's happy, sad, under a wave, in a tidal wave, stressed. We work with them to kind of understand how they're feeling and then kind of go from there. But it's important as parents, we recognize where we are. So just take a second in the chat, kind of put where you're feeling tonight. Are you surfing the wave? Are you floating? Are you treading water? Are you caught in a riptide? Are you underneath? Okay, caught in a riptide, tired. Well, surfing the waves, I like that. Underwater. Okay, we got a lot of different ones: treading, floating, surfing the waves. And why this is important is because as we recognize what's going on for us as parents, we're going to be more aware of our reactions. So I'm guessing if you're caught in a riptide and you come home and you're dealing with something with your child, you're going to most likely be more likely to emotionally react. You're going to be more likely possibly to yell. You're going to be more likely to kind of get into a power struggle with them. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about, and I really had to tap into when my girls were in middle school, was behaving my way into feeling better. I had to visualize how I wanted the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes to go. In particular, if I was feeling emotional or frustrated, and then I would have to behave my way into that ending. So if I was really frustrated with my daughter and I knew a lot of it was more about me and my work stress and just what was going on for me, I knew if I engaged, I would just lose it. So I had to walk away. So I would visualize how I wanted the situation to end. And then 9 times out of 10, I literally would walk away. And I was so happy I did, because the next day when I came back, I saw things from a totally different perspective. What I'm going to ask you to use the chat again. Lauren and I worked a long time, and Lauren's on here. We worked a long time in the school refusal program at Amita Health. I was there probably in the program for about 10 years. I helped to start the program. One of the things that we found with the students, and I think Lauren would say this, that would come into the program, was they had a really hard time problem solving, tolerating discomfort, and really figuring out what motivated them towards success. Like, what were those motivators? And parents would so often say, our kids don't care about anything. They only want to be on their games. Nothing motivates them. So I want you to think for a second, because from a behavioral standpoint, everything motivates the behavior. If the behavior is occurring, something is reinforcing it. And so it's about starting to shift that. So what would you say motivates your child at home? Feeling proud. I like that one, because I would say for my girls, I think part of the time it was pleasing others, positive affirmation, reassurance, and quality time. Okay, haven't figured it out. And it may appear, praise and activities, competition, it may appear for some that the motivator is video games. It may appear that the motivator is, talking to people online. It may appear that it's getting praise from parents or teachers. The other thing I want you to think about is, how do you define success for your child? What would success look like for your child? Okay, being happy. And success is going to look a little bit different for every child. So for some children, it might be considering where they are and just, doing something new, coming out of their comfort zone. Success is being happy. I see that a couple of times. Treating others with kindness, feeling proud, a sense of personal accomplishment, doing something new, getting good grades, being confident. I wanted my kids to be happy. I'm definitely, so I'm going to start with that, but I hear happy a lot. The problem with happy is it's not super realistic. And I hear a lot from kids that there is a lot of pressure on them to be happy. Why do adults want us to be happy all the time? Every time we look anything other than happy, someone says, what's wrong? And so I want you to keep that in mind, that when we kind of focus on that happy and comfortable, what that's going to do and how that's going to translate into that resiliency piece. How do you respond when your child is uncomfortable? Think about, as a parent, what do you do? How do you react when your child is anything other than happy or comfortable? Maybe they came home from school and they're feeling really sad. They look sad. They have a sad face. You give hugs, you want to reassure, you want to make them feel better. Think about, how do you respond when your child starts to experience discomfort? Maybe they were left out. Maybe they dealt with someone that was mean at school. Maybe they had a situation with a teacher. There's all kinds of things that could be challenging or difficult. I like that. Acknowledge their feelings and talk and listen to them. Lauren, do you have any other ones that I'm forgetting about?
No, I think these are all really good. For those of you that don't know who I am, you may have seen my name in various platforms, but I actually run the education department at Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health Hospital. But originally I was a middle school and a high school teacher and special education also. So first I was English language arts, then I went back, got my master's in special ed. Now I work at the hospital, but before that I worked in schools. I worked in the therapeutic day school. I worked with Jackie, as she said, at the hospital in the school anxiety program. And I actually am still the lead teacher, even though I run everything now. I actually am still the lead teacher for that program. So I see all of these things. And then I actually have a side business too, where I work with kids with executive functioning and academic tutoring. So it's called the Learning Lab, and I started it last year. So lots of fun things, but it's interesting. This question's always interesting because how parents define success. And if you asked your child how they define success, it might be totally different. And so I think a lot of times when I'm working with parents and I ask this question, they tell me happy always comes first. Mm-hmm. But I find for myself, and I think Jackie will agree, a lot of times we say, it's not your job to make them happy. It's your job to parent them. And we use that line a lot. And a lot of times parents stop and look at me and I'm like, there are going to be a lot of emotions that happen right now, but that also kind of means you're doing something right. So think about it that way too. Like if you're challenging something, you're actually helping them grow, and they may not like it. But that's the truth behind it. Like you are actually making them healthier. And so you might see all of those things come up, or tantrums or sadness or things like that, but that can actually be success too. And like taking baby steps forward. So it's important to kind of switch your lens a little bit sometimes as well.
And I think that's absolutely true. A lot of kids will tell us, why can't we just be sad? Why can't we just be upset sometimes? Why is someone always trying to make us feel better? And it kind of goes to what Lauren just said. Sometimes allowing them to work through it can be huge. I talk a lot about, as Denise said, I co-authored a book, Successful Parenting, and we talk a lot about the difference between purposeful parenting and kind of reactive, right? And again, I've been on the reactive side and I've tried to be on the purposeful side. I always joke with parents and I say, like, how many of you have like yelled at your kids, or how many of you have gotten into a power struggle with them and you realize, okay, this is silly. Like I'm sitting here arguing with my child. Or I've told my child like 16 times to do something and they're not listening. No one's listening to me. Well, and we laugh, Lauren and I laugh, like, don't try harder, try different. If what you're doing isn't working, then you want to take a step back and do something different and kind of try to do it, maybe even like one thing, 2 minutes every day for 2 weeks, but try to do something different. And you will see a change. You will see a change in your relationship. You may see a change in the child's behavior. And it starts with, what is your purpose as a parent? What are some things that you want your parenting to teach your child? Do you want your child to be like resilient? Do you want your child to be kind to others? Do you want your child to be someone that can bounce back? Do you want your child to be somebody that is motivated in school? Kind of start to think about what your purpose is And then we can start to reflect on, are my reactions in line with that? Would my child say, if I say to your child, what do your parents really care about? What do your parents like? What's important to your parents? A lot of them might say grades. And you might say, like, grades aren't important. I don't care that my child gets all A's. And then the child might say, well, why do you ride me on my homework? And every time I get a B or C, you ask me what happened. And so our children will be our harshest critics. I know mine were. When we start to ask them honest questions, they will tell us. And as parents, sometimes we do a great job of saying, that's not true. That's not right. That's not what happened. But sometimes it's understanding that it might be coming from their perspective. And so taking some of that in could be helpful. So think about kind of your purpose. Like, what are your goals with your child? Do you want them to learn to be uncomfortable? If you want your child to be uncomfortable, do you allow them to sit with that? Or do you kind of rush in every time they look anything other than happy and try to kind of smooth the way for them? And if you have any questions, feel free to chat. And this one takes a lot of practice. For me, it's whenever I would find myself just having a really strong emotion, I would just take a step back, and kind of like reflect on what was going on. Because of course I yelled and I got in power struggles, but I would go back to, is this really effective? If every time I walk in the door, my child's shutting the door on me and going in the room, maybe I need to kind of change up what I'm doing when I get home. Maybe I need to change up something in our routine if this is a dynamic. The second one too, and Denise has heard me say this, I have two daughters, 24 and almost 25. I don't know that they listen to a damn thing I said, but they act just like me. So food for thought, and Lauren would say this too, food for thought. Our children are learning from us. We're their best teachers in terms of how we behave and how we model. And so the best way to teach them is how we kind of manage, how we behave, how we interact. And that's not going to necessarily be true when they're younger. But you will see that as they get older and become adults themselves, they will have a lot of the same kind of responses, characteristics, and behaviors of us as the parents. I know that's kind of scary.
It's true though. And they're always paying attention. So even when you think they're not, they are, and they have pretty good insight too. So like when they come to me, they'll rat out parents all the time. Like I can ask 2 questions and the kids will tell me everything. And it's funny because then I work with the parents and I'm like, oh, I see why the kid's saying this. But it's also important to remember that they are responding to you as well. So some of the behaviors you might see, they actually might be intentionally doing them because they know it'll either make you back up or come forward. So it's interesting to think about that too. I was working with a patient earlier today and she's brand new. She was first day in program and she was talking about grandma because it's legal guardian and how every time she opens the door out of her room, it's just yelling. So I said, do you just assume that's going to happen or is it actually true? And she was like, no, it's yelling all the time. So it's just bad. I just don't come out of my room. So her anxieties just keep piling and piling. And I said, do you like that? Or would you like that to be different? And she said, I'd like it to be different. I said, have you ever told anyone? No. She's like, no one's ever asked me that question, which is interesting. So it's like, I don't know, you can kind of like feel it out too and be like, if this behavior is off for some reason, what else happened, right? Or if this is a pattern that I'm seeing, what can we do differently to try to break the pattern and then be consistent moving forward so that feels like a safe space?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that leads to the next one, putting things in perspective. Things that can be a really, really big deal right now might not be as big of a deal down the road. And so I think sometimes, small things can seem like, a huge thing. And we might kind of say to ourselves, oh my gosh, my child's a failure. I'm a failure as a parent. What's going on? My child's not going to be successful. Just because a child is struggling is not necessarily an indicator of the success that they're going to have down the road. Some of the kiddos that I've worked with that have been, I'll even say the hottest messes when they were in elementary, middle, and high school are some of the greatest success stories, and they are thriving and they are just killing it out of the park because they learned how to bounce back. They learned how to deal with adversity, and they learned how to trust others and build supports. And so if your child's struggling, it might cause you to want to panic, but you have to sometimes put things in perspective. One thing I like to do when I have a big reaction to something is even write down the evidence on a piece of paper, kind of think about the facts of the situation and try to separate it out from my emotion. And that can help me be a lot more rational when I'm talking to them too. Self-care, obviously, if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're run down, if we're burnt out, if we're just, it's going to be hard. And there's going to be times in parenting where you really don't have a lot of time for self-care. We have our own stuff. Some of us have had our own trauma. We have our own, adversity we're dealing with. And so you got to be real with yourself and seek the support when you need it, even if it's getting your own therapist. But I think that self-care is going to be evident because our children are only going to be as healthy as we are. And I think that saying is really true. This is something, I created with a colleague, Dr. Robin Choquette, years back. And we used this a lot when I was working in the hospital, because parents would call me all the time and say, I'm so concerned. I'm so worried about my child. My child's not doing well. My child's a good kid, but they're really, really struggling. And we don't understand why. So one of the things we realized that for parents, when their kids are struggling, they do worry about what happened. And we said, okay, it's not really about that. It's about understanding that each child is different in terms of their physical development, how they look. You might have a 10-year-old that looks 14, and you have to be careful because a lot of times people expect that 10-year-old to be 14 or act 14. Think about where your child is in terms of cognitive development. Are they more of a visual learner? Are they more of an auditory learner? How do they learn best? And this is going to be important because you have a child that's more of a visual learner and you're more of a talker or yeller. That child's just going to keep shutting down. If you have a child that maybe is more of a visual learner, then they may not do well with like excessive talking and dialogue. You might have to kind of keep the sentences kind of simple, concise. Think about the age of the child. You don't want to be giving like extensive commands to a child that is like in second or third grade. Typically, Lauren and I will say after a couple sentences, you can kind of read the child, ask for, making sure they're understanding and kind of really relating to what you're saying versus like going on and saying the same thing. But this is the thing. Every child is different where they are in terms of emotional development. You might have a child that is gifted and they are extremely bright. They might be 12 and like intellectually they're like on 14, 15, 16, but emotionally they might be like more like 7 or 8. They might have a hard time regulating. They might have a hard time communicating their needs, problem solving. And so as a clinician, what I started doing is when I would get a new intake, a new client, I would look at where the child was in terms of their kind of intellectual ability, in terms of their emotional development and physical development. And I even look at language. It's not about the child, in my opinion, being broken or needing to be fixed. It's not about the child being a good or bad kid. It's about where are they in terms of like emotional, intellectual, and physical development. And as a clinician, sometimes I have to come in and close the gaps. And I help families and parents when they're parenting kind of start to see that. An example, I had a parent say, my child's always lying to me. I'm just so frustrated. They don't do what I say. I tell them what to do. Like I'm yelling at them. They're not listening. They're disrespectful. I'm done. Right? How many of you have thought that at times? Right? We sat down and we started to kind of unpack some of this, and where the child was emotionally, the child was really struggling with perspective taking skills. Right? So the child wasn't really understanding the parent's perspective. And all they heard was the parent yelling. They didn't understand kind of why they were supposed to do that. The child was more of a visual learner, so they did better when it was on paper. And it was causing a lot of frustration and conflict. But when I sat with the parents and we looked at this, they started to say, okay, we really want to develop this perspective taking skill with our child. And so we are now going to have more discussion around kind of our goals and kind of what we're wanting and why we're saying and doing the things we are. And I know, Lauren, you talk about this a lot too.
Oh yeah, because I see it every day. And sometimes it's not apparent to parents. Like sometimes something that an outsider can see pretty quickly. I mean, they're your kids, so you're with them all the time. And it's not something that comes to the surface as fast as someone that's a third party and looking at the situation. But oftentimes, I'd say more than not, the emotional and intelligence scale do not match. I mean, by the time they come to see me, for sure, there's a huge discrepancy, and then we have to bridge that gap like Jackie's talking about. And it takes a whole team of people informing connections and seeing where each of those levels are and what we can do to kind of even them out a little bit. But it's hard, and it's hard for teachers too, to understand all the time what's actually in their classrooms. So like, I hear all the time, well, what do you mean they were in class? They know how to do this. Nope, they weren't listening to you. They were physically in your classroom, and it looks like they're listening and hearing you, but they didn't hear a word you said. And I've told people before, when Jackie and I do trainings like this, I'm like, if I email you and ask you for something, please do not respond to me. The child knows how to do it. Because if I'm emailing you, that child does not know how to do it, and neither does the parent. So it's an interesting like push that you have to do to actually kind of get to see where kids are and get other people to see where kids are. But more times than not, like something could be going on. I mean, especially if they're kids who are anxiety ridden or things like that. I mean, they could be having a million thoughts at one time going on in their head. They might look still and that they're listening to everything, but if they can't repeat back to you, if you ask them a question, they didn't hear you. And that happens in the classroom a lot. And let's face it, teachers spend a long time with your kids. So they're a good go-to to actually like talk about patterns and what's happening and what's not happening, because they see them consistently. And patterns during the day, like the beginning of the day or the end of the day might be really hard. The middle might be fine, might be all flipped. But that opens up a really good line of communication that can be had across the board between parents, school, therapists, whoever, of just figuring out what's going on. Because if it's happening at home, it's probably happening at school, vice versa. Environments can change and make things a little bit better, a little bit worse, but overall people are going to see the same types of behavior. So that will actually help figure out all of this and how to bring that so that the kids don't feel like they're struggling either. Because if their emotional scale and their intelligence scale is way off, they feel that too. So
well, and I think the considering expectations, I think when you think about kind of your expectations, and you don't have to do it now, when you sit and you think about kind of your expectations for your child, think about kind of, does your child know how to do these things? Does your child know, if it's homework, you're frustrated, they're not doing their homework. Do they have the executive functioning skills? Do they know, does your child, and we talk about this a lot, does your child know how to ask for help at school? Does your child know how to problem solve? Do they know how to like initiate, that communication piece? Think about, your child's skills. And if it's something that you're like, wait a minute, I don't really know if they know how to do that. Those are good opportunities to practice. Have your child practice asking for help. Have them practice kind of problem solving, depending on their age. But teaching them, allowing them to do those things, because sometimes I think as parents, we get really frustrated when our kids aren't doing things, or we think they're lying, or we think they're being defiant, but they may not have the skills to do these things, and they may not have the confidence. Recognizing, I love how someone earlier said, just really listening to your child, allowing your child, like if they're coming out of school and you're picking them up and they look sad, not responding with what's wrong, not always looking for the problem, but allowing the child to know it's okay to be angry, and it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be whatever, instead of what's wrong, you might want to say something like, oh, what's something that went well today and something that was difficult. You might have a child that, one thing wrong happened and they're like, it was a horrible day. The day was terrible. I hate school. Trying to prompt them on, okay, well, tell me something that happened that was terrible. Tell me one thing that happened that was difficult. And even for younger kids, what's one thing that you liked and one thing that you didn't? Because sometimes kids can be very like concrete thinkers. And if a child says to a parent, it was a horrible day, that parent's anxiety might go up. And pretty soon they're kind of colluding and focusing on maybe one difficult thing that happened in the day, rather than realizing it was a whole day of tons of stuff that happened. We don't need to spend a half an hour catastrophizing one thing and then calling the school and getting mad at the teacher. We can kind of take a step back maybe and say, wow, like, how did you deal with that? And maybe it's really like, and Lauren said too, our reactions are going to give meaning to the experience. If we're panicking and we're overreacting and we're texting our child back at school and we're kind of creating this whole thing when really your child could probably just kind of deal with it, even if it's really, really painful for you or the child. And so just being mindful of, I love how someone said, again, just listening, not even sometimes responding. Sometimes you can just listen. We don't need to give advice. We don't need to necessarily problem solve it. We can just listen and sometimes say, wow, you handled that really well. Like, you know what, this happened and you stuck it out today. I'm just so pleased and so excited for you that you were able just to kind of bounce back from that. And some parents will even look for opportunities when their kids do fall and just kind of really even leave them a note and say, like, you know what, I know that was difficult, that teacher, and you sometimes just, it doesn't go well, but I'm really excited that you still kind of stuck it out. And be mindful of reactions, think about your reactions. Again, you might struggle with your own anxiety. You might struggle with, and anxiety is a big one lately. And we hear that a lot. If you do struggle with your own kind of emotions and anxiety and regulating, maybe, you just get quick to anger, think about kind of your responses and what you do want to model and how you can manage that when you're responding. And that's really ultimately how we're going to teach that healthy coping. If we're teaching our kids how to cope in a healthy way, we have to be doing it too. So how we manage our emotions at home is going to be what teaches them how to manage theirs. And no one's perfect. We all yell, we all make mistakes. I think sometimes just, stopping and apologizing at times or talking to our kids about it and even saying, I know, I sometimes struggle with my own anxiety. I know I have a tendency to ask you how you are or if you're okay a lot, and I'm going to really work on that. And that can be huge. This is one of my favorite slides because it really does sum up resiliency. Children are going to face stress and challenges unique to their situation. Children are resilient. I talk a lot to parents, and parents will say, I feel so much guilt. My child is going through this because, maybe we're divorced or, this happened. And I just feel so sorry for my child that they had to deal with that. But truly children will face, stress and challenges. And when children discover they are capable of taking risks and tolerating failure, that's really when they start to believe that they can succeed. And confidence isn't, we don't gain confidence from others telling us we're wonderful. We gain confidence by realizing we can come out of our comfort zone, try something new, even at the risk of failure. So just something to think about. And when you look at people that really do achieve success in adulthood, it really is those individuals that are willing to tolerate failure and time again, continue to come out of their comfort zone. We say, our goal as clinicians is to teach people how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And as difficult as it is at times, if your child can start to learn to tolerate that, you will see them really start to experience that growth.
You have to learn how to fail better.
Right.
You have to become better at failing. Jackie, you got a question a little bit ago. I don't know, I think you saw it, but it says, when you know your child is lying, how should we handle the situation so that it can be a learning opportunity, or how should we respond?
I mean, I think it's important, depending on what the situation is, to talk about it. And I think, depending on, we're going to talk about that in a bit, depending on what the expectations are in the home, how you're going to manage some of that with them, and it's also going to be depending on the age, and how they're viewing the situation. Are they, and I run into this a lot too. There's two types kind of lying. Is it that their perception or perspective is totally different than yours? Or is it that they're eating a cookie and you're like, did you eat that cookie? And they have cookie crumbs all over their face. And they're like, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And that's where there can be some lessons in that. Lauren, I don't know if you have anything else than that, but I do think, talking to them about that also, and kind of like what happens when you lie, what in our house, when you are lying, this is going to be, I know we talked earlier, having our kids recognize our behavior leads to the outcome, I think. will be important. Sometimes loss of privilege, things like that.
And it's figuring out the why. I have a client right now who is a compulsive liar. He will admit it. But it is a learned behavior at this point, because in about 5th grade, he said that's when it started, because it would buy him time. So if he needed help or he was struggling, and let's say mom said, "Did you do your homework?" He's like, "Yep." And then he got to do the next thing, and it bought him time. She would figure it out, hours later, but in that whole time, he got it. So he's like, I just kind of kept doing it. And I said, what was the consequence when, mom figured it out? And he was like, nothing. Because by the time that they did, like a year later, they just got frustrated and didn't do anything. He's like, so then I learned that I could just keep doing whatever I wanted to do because nothing was going to happen. So what we did with him, and this is a more severe case, but what we did with him is a behavior contract and kind of incorporated other things, but something as simple as, is your homework done? He would say yes. And then I'd say, is it really done? No, which is funny because he would tell me the truth and lie to mom, literally seconds apart. And so we put in a contract that, you've got this organizer, you've got the things laid out. When you check it off, that means a truth that it's actually done. Don't check that box unless it's actually done. If you check the box, loss of privileges. And that's what we did. And we made it a reward system too, because he needed that. So he was working towards things also. So like going on a trip or getting to go out with his friends to wherever. But it is, mom and dad have said it's the only thing that really worked so far with him. He will still slip up though and say, yeah, it's done. And then they have to say, but is it really done? No, it's not. But now he's just uncomfortable saying the truth because he just hasn't for so long. So I think it's important to catch it at the middle school age so that that doesn't become the result. But there are little things you can do like that now. But I would definitely call it out in some way. But not have a really strong reaction that you're angry, because that's not going to let them tell you the truth. You just have to say, like, what's happening? How can we make this better? Why are you doing it? What are you getting out of it? And then work backwards from there.
One, I think understanding the why behind the behavior, is this an avoidance? Am I lying to avoid something? Am I lying to avoid getting in trouble? Am I lying to avoid having to deal with something uncomfortable? And we see a lot of avoidance behaviors. I love the saying, the child is not trying to give you a hard time, they're having a hard time. And so when your child is really reacting or, they're giving you a behavior, kind of starting to think about like, what's the why behind the behavior? As we've talked about, kind of, do they have the skills to manage, or do we need to teach them the skills? Like, maybe the child's having a temper tantrum or they're like falling apart. We need to, as parents, like maybe co-regulate with them. And what happens a lot of times when our kids get ramped up, we get ramped up, they get ramped up, and there's like a whole display. We want to stay almost calmer as they're escalating. If we escalate, it's not going to be helpful. And I know that's easier said than done. Our kids know how to push our buttons, right? Like, I'm sure if I got all your kids in the room and said, okay, how do you push mom and dad's buttons? How do you get them mad? How do you get them to light off? They are going to know exactly where, sometimes detaching a little bit and like just not. And we like to say, give the opposite reaction and kind of throw them off a little bit. But if you see a lot of the lying, is that a little bit of kind of avoidance behavior? And sometimes kids will get frustrated with themselves. I know someone said they might call themselves stupid, they might put themselves down. And, you want to be careful with that because, and we're going to talk about this in another parent night, but sometimes kids seek a lot of reassurance from us, which actually can make things worse. So if a child says, I'm so stupid, instead of saying, no, you're not, you're really smart, you're wonderful, you might start to kind of tap into, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And kind of where is that coming from? Why do you think you're stupid? I think as parents, again, we have a tendency to kind of go in with the praise, but that's not going to help that. It really is about tapping into what's happening. Our children are going to be overwhelmed. And these are some key ingredients, when they lack practice. So maybe the child, has anxiety about going to school because they are having a hard time, or they're struggling just being able to communicate to peers. We see a lot of this with the gamers where they game a lot and they're comfortable on the gaming, but they have a hard time with social interactions, eye contact, asking for help, communicating. These are things we spend a lot of time practicing, having, when your child's at the dinner table, practicing the conversations and the eye contact. When our kids set unrealistic expectations, I can't tell you, I asked a group of 100 middle schoolers and I said, how many of you believe you can be successful at school? And I got to be honest, very few of them raised their hand. A lot of our kids don't believe that they can be successful. And part of that is because they don't set realistic expectations. They feel like they have to be the best or perfect or good at everything, and social media plays a role in that too. And so helping our children realize everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and what are realistic expectations, to have. And I think when you ask your child, things like, are you successful at school? What is that? Again, depending on the age, you'll get a lot. Not sure how to problem solve. If you think about it and you're struggling and you have no idea how to solve a problem. So when you hit a roadblock at school or you hit a roadblock somewhere and you don't believe that you have the tools, that's going to be a pretty scary experience. Out of routine, you might have a child, and we see this with the school anxiety kids. They have a hard time every Monday after a break. Anytime they're out of that routine after break, we see a regression in behavior, because a lot of children with mental health issues, with emotional issues, medical symptoms, they do better with routine and structure. And so when they're out of that, we see that they kind of fall apart. And so just bringing in, and it can be small things, even if you do the same thing every day, or you get a little bit of a schedule, that can help. And then the last one, our children will struggle when they don't have confidence that they can be successful. So if you have a child that doesn't believe they can be successful, or doesn't believe that they can impact their path, that child's going to just shut down and avoid situations where they may experience any failure. This is, we started the night. I know we don't have a ton of time. We started the night with kind of resilience, and I think we all agreed what some key ingredients were, allowing our children to experience discomfort. I love this one. Celebrating successes and failures, every night at dinner, what's one thing that went well and what's one thing that totally was awful today, or we bombed, and kind of laughing about both. Being mindful of our own reactions. If every time the child has, sad or is left out, we're like, oh my gosh, that's teaching the child that, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to fit in all the time and this isn't okay, or I'm supposed to be happy, or, I don't know how to do this. And then just modeling those healthy coping skills. And this is too something that you can take back and reflect on, if you think about, and you can put some in the chat, because I have the next sheet is going to give some examples of what elementary and middle school kids actually said. What are situations that cause your child to be uncomfortable? And then we're going to give some examples. What are some things maybe that are hard for your child or make them uncomfortable? And it could be like meeting new friends. It could be disappointing others. It could be, we hear this a lot, making a mistake in class, being made fun of. Okay, large group settings. And think about those, because, going outside of the house, being in the spotlight, or getting praise. These are actually really common ones. Being alone, going to the store and talking to a cashier. We hear these all the time. Mistakes in class, and teachers' response in front of the classroom. When she makes trips or messes up something, totally, writing assignments, mistakes in class. So we're gonna go to this real quick, and I'm gonna tell you, I probably speak to tens of thousands of kids each year, and I'm not joking. And I will tell you, this is pretty much some of the common ones I get. So when we look at this list, And I would say pretty much every child in elementary and middle school would agree that some of these are on their list. So, if you look in here, this one in particular was middle school and high schoolers, and we had an astounding, pretty much across the board, that most of them got most of this on the list. So speaking in front of a group, talking to classmates, being the center of attention, and you can kind of read on. These are real fears that, many of our kids face, and they may avoid when these things come up, depending on how uncomfortable they are with the situation. So what we do is we spend a lot of time. One, I will have kids kind of circle, which of these are hard for you? Again, depending on their age, I have to make the language, according to their age. We would have them circle, and then over time we would practice some of these, and we would have to kind of, for instance, I had a middle school and a high schooler that were nervous about asking questions in a store. And so we practiced going to Walgreens, and we practice asking for help from the cashier. We practice asking really simple questions. Sometimes I would give them the question. Sometimes we would make it funny. Sometimes we would make it more challenging. But the biggest thing is for kids to realize that, most kids have things that they're uncomfortable with. And, the more they practice, the easier it's going to be and the more confident they're going to become. So this goes to, how do you typically respond when your child is nervous? Do you have a tendency? And sometimes we'll label our kids, my child's just anxious, or my child's just shy. And you want to be cautious of that, because if you have a child that maybe doesn't answer and then you're answering for them, that's just reinforcing that, but allowing that child to be uncomfortable. And sometimes even there being some silence. I had a situation where the child was texting the mom to come get her from school, and the mom was texting her during the day and she wanted to go get her. And we talked about how that was reinforcing avoidant behavior. A child refuses to go to school because they don't feel well, or they're scared to go to school, and we let them stay home and play their video games. It's about kind of, do we have expectations in our home that we keep consistent, even if the child is uncomfortable or struggling, or do we keep the expectations the same? So as we've talked about, allowing our kids to feel not just happy, but kind of feel all those feelings, and allowing them to know, that there's no good or bad feelings, that there's just feelings. And as you start to kind of get in tune with some of this stuff, that's how you develop happiness. Recognizing challenges, celebrate, how they deal with adversity and challenges. And we talk about that a lot of times. We'll say, what's one thing that was difficult for you, and how did you deal with that? And, really just listen to how the child kind of responded. And sometimes, the child, you may feel like the child didn't do a good job, but maybe asking the child, like, do you like how you responded? Or, do you like the outcome? What could you have done differently? The other one is something I'm grateful for, and something that is difficult, and modeling it, saying these things to the child. So, and this is really going to be, truly everyone has strengths and everybody has limitations. And I think the more kids realize that, like, I don't have to be good at everything. Everyone has things that they're not good at. And so maybe I'm good at this, but I really struggle in these areas. And so really allowing the child to embrace both. You might be really good at this, but, this might not be kind of in your wheelhouse, and that's okay. Let's be honest. I had a dad and his son, and he was like, my son is going to be in the NBA. My son's amazing. And I was like, is your son good at basketball? And he's like, not really, and we joked, but it's like, sometimes I think we bolster our kids, and it's not always real, and it's not always rational. And I would even say to kids in the program, your teacher may not love you. They may not enjoy being with you. How are you going to manage that? And that was a high schooler. Don't worry, not an elementary. But sometimes we're honest, these things may happen. How are you going to deal with it? You may not get invited to this birthday party. People don't get invited to parties. What could you do instead? And while you might be feeling really upset inside, I think when you can kind of normalize some of these struggles for kids, they end up really appreciating it. Just developing relationships. We hear this a lot of time too, that my child's, buried in the room in their video games. Sometimes if you feel like your child's not coming out of the room, taking the stuff out of the room. When we do things different, and we do this all the time with parent training, no child ever comes and says, "Thank you, Jackie and Lauren, for teaching my parents to take the video games out of the room." Usually, sometimes, and we talked about this during the last session, kids may get really irate and aggressive when you do something new. They might get really mad. They might play the sympathy card. It takes 2 weeks to build any new routine and change any behaviors. So if you want to do something different in your home, just know, you have to be consistent with it for 2 weeks. The behavior of your child is probably going to get worse before it gets better, but it will develop into a new habit. And if you have concerns about your child, there's a lot of resources that we're gonna touch on before we end. So again, and this is going to be, you all have access to this. These are just some things to think about, before you leave, kind of just recognizing tonight based on what we've talked about. What are things, what are your goals for your child? What do you want your parenting to reflect? Where are you at? Kind of what's your hot button? Like, what triggers you to react? What triggers you to start to over reassure your child? What triggers you maybe to yell at your child? What are your hot buttons? Be aware of that. What are your goals? Be consistent. Maybe the child just needs some more routine. How are we communicating? And then, and there's going to be obstacles at times. You might be like, I'm working 2 jobs. I don't have time for this. I've worked with parents on, the only thing we worked on is just not yelling and not being overly reactive. And that's all we worked on. And that we saw a difference in the child. So sometimes it can be the smallest of things that when you try it for 2 weeks, it makes a big difference. And these are just kind of to sum up what we've talked about today. Things may seem really challenging in the moment. Again, rather than catastrophizing, my child's not doing well, this is terrible, this is awful. Start to kind of take a step back, assess what's going on, problem solve, kind of think, can we have a plan or do we need additional resources? And then I think the realistic expectations, and I put this up here because we're going to be talking more about this in our next one too. Because I think this is one that we come back to a lot. And we all, as parents, me and Lauren, all the time, need coping strategies. We all struggle as adults. Many of us deal with sadness. We deal with our own anxiety. We deal with issues at work, relationships. We're all human and we're all in it together, much like our kids. There is no perfect parent. There's no perfect family. We all need coping skills, whether it's in a car sitting for 2 minutes and just, letting yourself be, kind of grounding. We teach our kids, think about your 5 senses. What's one thing you see? What's one thing you hear? What's one thing you feel? What's one thing you taste? What's one thing you touch? Just to sit. Children oftentimes don't realize that to start to feel a tad bit better, it takes doing a coping skill for 2 minutes. So sometimes kids are like, I'm breathing. That didn't work. It's about, slowing down, spending time in conversation when you're not on the electronics and they're not. We work on breathing, muscle relaxation. And like I said earlier, behaving your way to feel better. If you're just totally beside yourself, kind of visualize how you want the next 15 minutes to go and really just start to behave your way into that ending. And it works. Believe me, use it every day. When professional help is needed. So every one of you has a social worker in the school or a pediatrician, or there are therapists in the community, both virtual and in person. If you notice any of these issues with your child, if you're concerned, maybe there's a change in academic functioning, the child doesn't seem motivated, any of these concerns, definitely reach out for support. More parents now than ever are connecting with other parents. They're reaching out for resources. I think we all realize that there's a lot going on. And since the pandemic, honestly, schools are struggling. So it's not just families. I'm noticing, and I consult with about like 30 different schools. they're all struggling. And so many of the teachers are parents who are struggling with their kids, so this is kind of across the board. And so we need to reach out to each other more than ever. This is the podcast and the parenting book that I've put together. Feel free to join in. Like Lauren said, Lauren is an amazing executive functioning coach. She works with all ages. She is in our office in Arlington Heights, but she travels. She goes to different offices. Feel free to we have a couple resources if you're worried about your child in school or they need more help or they're not motivated. Sometimes it's a small thing that if we teach them a few like skills, it can make a huge difference. This is also my team in Crystal Lake. We have 30 therapists now at the Center for Emotional Wellness, and we're in Arlington Heights and Crystal Lake. We have, I think, two more parenting presentations after this, covering different topics. If there's certain things you want us to touch on, feel free to reach out to me, email or text, and we can cover that at the next one. Thank you, Lauren. And I think we have, if you want to join our emailing list for updates, feel free to text that number. Lauren's got the Learning Lab information in the website. If for some reason you're watching the video and you don't have the chat, because I don't really know how that works, feel free to just reach out to me.